Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome Alan Moran. Welcome, Alan.
Hi, Arnis. Good to see you.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Alan. Today's backdrop is actually from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's website, and it just shows the interrelatedness and the inputs in regard to the actual management of the dam. I noted, I'm going to actually cut across and just go through a couple of different images that I've gone through this morning. This is Alan's regulation economics, which I think is important to understand where Alan is coming from and his thought process. Now, New South Wales government decision is to lift an embargo on the floodplains for 3 days. The irrigators are allowed to pump for 3 days, and this was just 5 minutes ago that news came out. Queensland government is planning to demolish the Paradise Dam. This is a very interesting article because the engineers who inspected the dam have found nothing significantly wrong with the dam. And so it's a political issue rather than an integrity or safety issue. The Mike Keelty is the Murray-Darling Basin Plan cop. They call him the cop, and he's doing a tour. And there's images there of water finding its way into people's dams when there's pumping embargoes. And this is Mike Keelty again um, doing a tour around Australia. In this case, it's Mildura and that. So I think that that's important. We've had a look at some of the issues that are going on in the Murray-Darling. Um, I think it's quite important that we consider that the federal government, since 2007 Water Act, is actually managing the entire Murray-Darling Basin. And prior to that, it was recognised that it was actually a state function, and it was an agreement between the states that they would actually do that. So we've only had 13 years of, if you like, this act, and I don't believe it's been a particularly good act. In fact, I think the farmers are worse off, and the community, of course, because if the farmers are worse off through paying more price for water, it's reflected in prices in the supermarket, in food, and of course, if industry happens to use water, then it is reflected in increased prices there. So it is inflationary, and I think that that's very important to take that into account. Alan, your thoughts?
Oh, well, I couldn't agree more. That basically it's been a disaster. The federal government takeover. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't think any government takeover is to be welcomed in this respect. But certainly, once it became a political football for the federal government, it then became a football to say, well, how can we win votes in amongst sort of inner city greens, for example? Oh, we can do that by taking the water from farmers, which was used to grow crops, and giving it to the environment. And
Mm.
sure as eggs are eggs, that's what happened. Keelty may well be a very fine cop there, but basically he's running a policy which the government have put in place to actually reduce the amount of water available. And if you reduce the amount of water available or anything else available, then the price goes up. It's reflected in the costs to us as consumers. It's certainly reflected in the income which the farmers around there can assemble, and it's reflected in the health and the standard of living of the various communities concerned in what is roughly 1/7 of the continent.
Yeah, no, that is a good opening salvo, and thank you for that, Alan. And the thing is that the federal government administering an act of which, as I understand it, I think it's Section 100, clearly says that the waterways of the state shall be free. So that excludes the federal government. So this act is actually in defiance of that particular part of our constitution. But also that New South Wales, it wasn't that long ago, was bleating that they were going to drop out of the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement because they weren't getting what they wanted. And here it is, in spite of that, they're allowing irrigators to pump unmetered for 3 days, pump
Mm.
water out of this because of what's going on. And the thing is that to me is it's almost like acts of war between the states to try and vie for position. A chronic shortage is created, and the expense of it, of course, is really indebting farmers even further than they already are. It's exasperating their existing debts, compounding it, and then they're not doing anyone any favours. So Queensland, I don't know what Queensland is doing by shutting down a dam and basically condemning a dam that is still viable. Engineers have certified it, inspected it, and said it is still viable. Your thoughts, Alan?
I think it's total madness, and it's basically the Palestinian government is so green, so anti development, so anti wealth creation that it will do these acts of vandalism, if you like,
Hmm.
in that respect. And in respect of the New South Wales government allowing pumping, well, I don't, the ins and outs of this are more difficult to actually assess because essentially the first ones to allow this were the Queensland government, allowed its farmers to do it, and New South Wales was alarmed and in fact astounded that they did, and so they've allowed it, and there's
Hmm.
probably a knock-on effect into Victoria and South Australia. But one of the things is this would have occurred with or without the federal takeover of water. And as you know, the federals under the Constitution is so lax in some respects that they'll always find a reason to take something over. It could be on Corporations Act, or it could be on interstate freedom of water, interstate, or electricity interstate, or whatever it is.
Hmm.
The the sort of imperialism of the Commonwealth over the states is something which we've seen since 1901.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's very to me. What it shows is that if you look at the situation with farmers, farmers are under the existing, if you like, the existing financial economic system. Farmers are vying with each other for market share. They're vying for markets in order to liquidate their prices, their costs. And then it's reflected in communities, if you like, the riverina competing perhaps with the Riverland in South Australia for
Mm.
market share. And then, of course, it escalates up into states vying for their market share and to actually represent the people who live in each state. That's what I'm seeing now. And it is no different. To me, it's no different. This level of competition of vying over a shortage being money to liquidate their costs, clearing debts, this ability to actually clear their debts to redeem them, and so it becomes a point where market share is actually into the international area. And of course, companies are vying for, they're trying to seize markets, overseas markets, in order to liquidate their costs, redeem their debts in their own nation. To me, it's time that we actually looked at this whole thing called debt. This whole thing called debt, because it starts at an early age now. You think about the student debt. If you're a highly trained professional, 100,000, 200,000 debt. You look at the home mortgage. I saw it in today, Melbourne, Perth, and Sydney, more than $500,000 average mortgage. Now the thing is that with the national debt, you consider that. I'm actually looking at it from if you like, a philosophical point of view, that someone who is born today is actually inheriting a debt that could be 100 years old. They're actually inheriting as part of the national debt. 1694 Bank of England, the establishment of the national debt, that's more than 300 years old, and it has never, ever been redeemed. Alan, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think the debt is debt. I don't know about the 1694 debt, but certainly there was something called a sinking fund introduced in the 18th century, and that paid off
Hmm.
most British debt, I think. And
Hmm.
the debt has rose essentially from World War One and World War Two and beyond. Australia, we were relatively debt free until the Second World War. But there's debt like that. That is in individual debt, and that's something which you're born with as a citizen, and the state has undertaken that debt. They've got to pay it back, or they default on it, and there are penalties, international penalties for that. The debt that you collect yourself is something which you or somebody has made a decision about, and if you've got student debt, then you've got to pay it back. The alternative is somebody else pays it back, and I suppose that if you're a sort of a working guy and you see a doctor or a dentist, and who's been highly trained for 7 or 8 years at quite big cost, you feel as though you shouldn't be the person paying off his debt, since he gains the advantage of that in the high income. So I suppose there's a certain equity in terms of you've actually incurred costs in gaining skills, which then allow you to earn a lot of money, and it's not fair on other people if you're asking them or forcing them to pay those debts that have been incurred, and that's the
Mm.
kind of student loan debt. There are other debts that you mentioned as well, housing debts. Again, they are voluntarily undertaken into and you've got to be paid back. But to a great degree, those debts have been massively amplified, or the need for the debts, by government policy on housing, which has escalated the price by restricting the amount of land that can be used for housing. And we can find today a house being built, it costs about 3/4 of the cost is the land itself, or rather, certainly more than half, probably 3/4, depending where you are, is the land itself. 30 years ago, the land was a very small amount because land was generally available for housing. Now it's not generally available, and the reason why it's not generally available, not that we're running short of land, the stacks of land. This is Australia's got more land than anywhere else in the world. It's because government restraints on the use of land through the Planning Act prevents people from subdividing farmland or any other land on the periphery of cities and building houses there, except when they've got a permission to do so, and the government restrains that permission, and has done so increasingly, with the result that the prices have escalated.
Mm. I think that's perhaps part of the considerations that we've got to take into account, Alan. I'm just going to cut across to some websites, and so I'll lose your audio just for a minute, Alan. Um, let's just do that now. The first one is the GDP, gross domestic product for Australia, 1.32 trillion. 1.32 trillion. Now, I went to the debt clock and I noted that Australia's current debt is 5 times that number, 7.5 trillion. Australia's debt clock. The 1.3 is our gross domestic product. Government debt is over 1 trillion. Household debt 2.6 trillion. So there's absolutely astronomical. 5 times the value of what we produce, we're in debt, and I don't see how we can physically do that. Here is a chart illustrating the student debt from 1977, charting to about 2012. And as you can see, the chart is logarithmic. And just to reinforce the mortgage markets, average of 500,000, but in New South Wales hitting 621,500 average mortgage debt. And then this is the last chart, which shows the blue line being the value of commodities coming from farms, and the red line being the increase of debt that farmers are actually experiencing. So to me, the actual numbers, I understand what you're saying about land, but that in itself, I think the only industry that's left in Australia, because we've lost so much through the Lima Declaration, the only industry left is the housing market. And so the developers are doing everything they can to exploit it to make as much money as they can. So they're probably the only ones who've still got money in their pocket. But the rest of Australia, who having lost our manufacturing, our steel, our ship, aluminiums that were all over the place, oil refineries, our white goods, um, all gone. Car manufacturing, it's all gone. It's all gone. All the ancillary industries that Australia had. We came out of the Second World War. We even had not only trucks, but we were actually building aeroplanes. We were building aeroplanes. We were so productive. And all of that industry has gone since the mid 40s. It's all gone, and we're left here holding the bag with student debt going through the roof, private personal debt going through the roof, government debt is almost as much as GDP. It's our debt is irredeemable. We will never be able to work our way out of this. And this is where we are. We are in no man's land, and we've actually got to look at this whole system of how could we be so indebted when all we're doing is digging up all our raw, whatever we've got, assets and handing them over to other nations. We're handing everything that we've got, we're selling everything that we've got, and yet we've got this debt 5 times our GDP. We can work non-stop for 5 years, give it all to the banks, and we won't even be having food on our own table. That's how absurd this debt is. It's logarithmic. It's not going up progressive. It's going up straight through the roof, like that famous J curve. Your thoughts, Alan?
Well, I think that's true. The debt situation is serious. There's two elements of debt. Of course, one is the government debt, which is created by because the government's been running deficits for so long, and that's out of hand. The present government says it's trying to put a stop to that. You know, they're constrained in doing so because other parliamentarians in the Senate, whatever, won't let them increase taxes or reduce spending as fast as they need to. But that's one aspect of it, and certainly that debt is caused by excessive government spending because the governments are trying to buy votes and give people free goods, free stuff. Well, there's nothing free in this world, as you know. If you give it free, you either have to tax somebody for it or you print money to give it to them, and that's what's been happening. The other debt is individual debt, and a lot of that is I think, as you mentioned, is household debt, and it's debt incurred. You mentioned student loans, but the main part is on housing. People are borrowing and getting themselves into a great deal of debt on housing. Well, there's two facets of that. One is that the housing prices have gone up exorbitantly as a result of government's restraint on the use of land, which has massively forced up the land component of housing. The other is that the interest rates have gone down, so people feel as though they can afford more. It was all very well. We could hark back to the 1990s when interest rates were 17%. Today they're 3% or whatever. So in that sense, it's affordable. Now, whether it's affordable on a sustained basis, if you look at that logarithmic curve you pointed out to, what happens to that curve if interest rates go to 5% or 6% or 7%? Well, it'd be a total disaster. And can anybody guarantee that interest rates won't go to there? Because they've certainly been there before. They've been a lot higher than there before. If they go there again, the country will be in turmoil. There'll be massive debts, and it'll grind to a halt, at least until these things iron themselves out again, and the prices under which the debt is based fall, and people default on debt or whatever it is. But certainly, it's a precarious position we've got when we have run up so much personal debt, which the government has facilitated by having low interest rates, by printing money, essentially. At some stage, if it no longer facilitates something, it feels as though it can't, and it would seem at some stage it can't, because you can't go logarithmically forever, then there's a crunch comes, and it's a major problem then for the economy as a whole, certainly for anybody who either owes debt or his own debt.
Yeah, I see it as irredeemable, Alan. I don't see a way out of this, and I don't see a government person actually explaining how we're going to turn this level of indebtedness around. I don't hear it. There's a void. There is an absolute void. There is no industry. Our industry is being deconstructed. Our power generation, our water is being deconstructed. Our infrastructure is being run down, and our indebtedness is going through the roof. And no one is talking about it, and no one is offering any solutions whatsoever. It's almost as if they've walked up to the abyss, the cliff, and they're ready to jump off, and just we're going to lose control of the whole thing. Absolutely, I can't hear it. I can't hear it. The papers are not talking about it. The news outlets are not talking about it. They'll talk about bushfires, or they'll talk about this or that, or some young girl from overseas doing this and that, and all the things that don't count. But the fact is, there's no new industries coming to Australia. There's no way of us actually earning the money. If you take industry, we lost multiple car manufacturers in Adelaide. All of that base is gone. That income base is gone. If we can't work, we can't pay things off. It's just physically, financially impossible.
Exactly.
No government is working towards this. We are in this thing in free fall of debt. We're swimming in it. And was it 2000, the global financial crisis, when that happened, it was exactly the same in America. And we're looking at it, staring it in our face, and the news outlets are saying nothing. Alan.
Well, I think, and in fact, it's interesting you mentioned America, because certainly there we are seeing a redevelopment, a reindustrialization under the Bush administration, which has basically said we're going to reduce a lot of these regulations on land use, on energy use, and other things, and that way we'll become cheaper and we'll attract industry here. So car manufacturers from Germany and Japan, they're relocating into America. Our own the Pratt Industries, one of the biggest employers in Australia for cardboard boxes. Where is it developing its cardboard boxes? Now in Tennessee, not in Australia. Why is that? Well, the price of a lot of the cost of these cardboard boxes is actually in energy, and if the energy is a third of the cost of Australia. Well, where else are they going to locate? But why is it a third of the cost in America than Australia?
Yeah.
Because the government has actually implemented energy policies, forcing us to have renewable energy, preventing people using coal, preventing people even looking for gas, which has transformed Australia from being one of the lowest cost energy producers only like 20 years ago, less than 20 years, 10 years ago, one of the lowest cost energy producers in the world to becoming one of the highest. And that
Yeah.
has caused the demise, instrumental in causing the demise of some of these manufacturing industries and farming industries, which we are potentially very efficient at. Now, I think it's a bleak picture to say all our industries gone, because we do have industries like gas and coal, which have actually been flourishing. But no government really wants them. They're ashamed of them, and Labour would stop them. The Greens would certainly stop them tomorrow. We could have much flourishing agricultural industries. We've talked a little bit about one of the reasons why we don't is because we don't allow water to be developed, and when it is developed, we derate the systems. Our biggest irrigation area in the country, which is the Murray-Darling, we derate it by taking the water from productive purposes and giving it to what they call environmental purposes. Now, all of these things, this could and should be the wealthiest country in the world in terms of natural wealth, per capita natural wealth. It's enormous.
Yeah.
But we have governments which are ashamed of our wealth and take steps to prevent us exploiting it and earning income from it, and welcome the fact that when we lose industries which are, quote, polluting, unquote, welcome the fact that they've gone. And yet they are going, and in the end it will impoverish us, at least relatively, from what we could be. We could have the highest standard, we should have the highest standard of living in the world, and we haven't because of government action.
Yeah, it's not just government. It's also, to me, the fact that we can't liquidate our debts. I appreciate where you're coming from, Alan. This is a really unsettling forum for me, because I'm looking at this, and to me, everything is showing that we are in for a major adjustment. A major adjustment. Australia is, in my view, in dire straits. Now, I was in oil and gas, and I can tell you that refineries shut around Australia, and that one of our biggest hubs, Santos at Moomba, which sent gas to Sydney and Victoria and to South Australia, is now redirecting a good part of that gas to Gladstone, which is Queensland, and then shipped off overseas. So even our industries, our gas industries, while they do employ some numbers, it's certainly a lot less than what a car manufacturer would do, and white goods and all the other industries that go with it. We used to have steel and shipbuilding at Whyalla, and also power generation, and that's all gone. It's all history. It's just you're looking at a void there of a backwater of what was once the hub of apprenticeships in Australia. It was from that industrial hub, the Iron Triangle, that the apprentices would go out all around Australia, and all of that is gone. And that goes back, like the Fraser era was the shutting down of our shipyards. It goes back to then. We've had 40 years of this, and it does not look pretty at all. It's really, really frustrating. And the thing is that a show like this, we should be able to provide an answer, a clear direction. And I see it that we've got to actually have another look at this whole thing about finance, this whole thing about economics. What's the purpose of it? And where does the money come from? Where does it come from? Is it actually our own banking system, or are we actually subject to foreign control? And I think that that's a very, very pertinent question. Alan, closing comments and thoughts, please.
Well, I think foreign control. Everybody's subject to some foreign control or constraints. Certainly, we can't just do what we want because we've got to pay debts to other countries and all that sort of business. There are certainly industries. I don't know about white goods industries and things like that, but you mentioned the gas industry. Australia's got stacks of gas.
I know,
We've got gas like in the United States.
I know.
We just the government of Victoria, of South Australia, and of New South Wales does not permit us to look for it. It says you can't even look for it. Not only you can't tap it, you can't look for it. It's been opened recently in Northern Territory. I hope that'll go somewhere. Queensland is somewhat better, but if you've got cheap access to cheap gas, that gives you potentially a massive new industry structure. Not only as for low power, but it's feedstock for a whole lot of chemical industries and various things like that. You mentioned what a joke it would be here. Somebody came along and said, we've got this gas and we've got some oil, we want to build a new refinery. Can you imagine the preventative positions from the Greens and various others saying, oh, you can't build a new refinery, no, you can't do it. I mean, it would be 10 years before it got off the ground. And that's because we've actually got a great productive culture here for actually producing regulations and for actually stopping people producing things. With any number of different commissions of inquiry and regulatory agencies would be needed to be gone through. We built a new coal mine, Adani coal mine. 9 years it took this coal mine to pass all the regulatory hoops. 9 years. This is a country committing suicide in terms of the constraints on productive activity which have been placed there, willingly placed there by governments. And really, it is stifling any possibility of the resurrection of the nation in terms of becoming, once again, one of the richest countries in the world.
Yeah, I see that richness in Australia looking internally and being self-reliant. As far as gas goes, there was a couple of omissions from the other week that I neglected to fail to mention. One was the gas refinery in Darwin, and there's also Basin, which is northwest Western Australia. But the fact is that the gas fields in the ocean, what they do is they actually they build a giant ship called a FPSO, Floating Production Storage Offloading Vessel, of which it can actually drill the holes, do the pick up the holes already drilled, process the gas, and then ship it internationally straight from the ship. It never actually comes ashore, and there's no physical reason why an FPSO couldn't be constructed, even a shallow water FPSO, and we could be off the coast and doing it all and not subject to anything other than just political will. There is no shortage of gas. Coal seam gas is only one facet. There's also the shale oil. There's another facet. There's Bass Strait. There's Cooper Basin. There's all the giant shale deposits through New South Wales, Western New South Wales, going all the way through to Queensland, Gulf of Carpentaria. It's absolutely colossal. It's the size of New South Wales is our shale oil deposits, and all of that is there for the lucky country. But the fact is that our deconstruction is almost complete, and that deconstruction is complicit between no matter which government you get. Which government you get has actually been complicit in this deconstruction, whether it's state or it's federal, of all flavours, they're all doing it. Most recently, the Paradise Dam in Queensland being shut for no technical, no physical, no structural, no safety reason, but rather political. And I know that when they turned off the power generation at Port Augusta, the Labor government in South Australia made a point of dynamiting it and putting the image of that dynamiting on the media. Every media outlet carried it. This is what we think of that particular energy source. It really is this whole green thing is against Australia, and we've got to recognise it, that it's not a good state of affairs. It's actually a very, very poor state of affairs.
Very, very, exactly so. And how we turn this around, I don't know. I mean, hopefully you'll have some modest influence, and hopefully I will as well. But in the end, it's suicidal for the nation. Basically, a nation with fabulous resources is rejecting them and indeed blowing them up even.
Yeah.
What an act of bastardry that is.
Yeah, what an act of bastardry. That's exactly right. It's an act of vandalism against our own people by our parliaments, and we've got to recognise it. Alan Moran, this is a tough one. I've come out of it unsettled, but I really appreciate the fact that we've gone in deep to have a look at this question of debt and what our governments have actually historically done and what they're continuing to do. Thank you so much.
Arnis, It was my pleasure. Thank
No
you.
worries.